The dazzling glamour of Hollywood couldn't withstand the icy grip of handcuffs on Helen Morgan's wrists. The Mafia never revered the queen of the stage. They merely used her as a perfect human shield to absorb the full force of federal punishment. The mob bosses, pocketing millions of dollars in cash, quietly retreated into the shadows, abandoning the American beauty icon to a life of utter ruin and decay. But long before she was reduced to a pawn in a gangster's game, she was simply a girl fighting her way out of obscurity. Helen Morgan was born on August 2nd, 1900. She did not inherit wealth or privilege. She clawed her way up from the grueling, unforgiving chorus lines of Chicago. She survived the brutal grind of vaudeville. By the late 1920s, she sat at the absolute pinnacle of the entertainment industry. She was the mesmerizing voice of the global blockbuster showboat. She sat atop grand pianos in sold-out theaters, singing torch songs that captivated a nation. Her face commanded billboards across the country. Her melancholic voice echoed from every phonograph. She was the undisputed queen of the stage and screen, but a massive vulnerability hid behind the blinding spotlight. Helen was a pure artist. She lived entirely for the stage. She focused all her energy on the emotional resonance of her music and the intense pressure of maintaining her public image. She ignored the mechanics of business. She knew nothing about corporate structure. She knew nothing about tax law. She knew nothing about the legal liabilities of holding a business license. She understood nothing of corporate liability, leaving her legally vulnerable to the syndicates that controlled the nightlife economy. The era of prohibition created the perfect environment for these predators. The United States government banned the sale and consumption of alcohol. This single legislative act handed the entire nighttime economy to the underworld. New York City transformed into a sprawling network of illegal speakeasies and hidden clubs. The mobsters who ran these syndicates were not uneducated street thugs. They were highly organized, ruthless businessmen. They operated shadow corporations. They needed physical venues to move their illicit product. They needed pristine fronts to launder their dirty money. Above all, they needed public faces. They needed individuals the public adored and the police hesitated to raid. Larry Fay was the apex predator of this corrupt ecosystem. He was one of the most cunning and vicious mob bosses in New York. He built his empire through violence and extortion, controlling milk rackets and taxi fleets before dominating the nightclub scene. Fay possessed no empathy. He viewed human beings purely as tools for leverage. He did not look like a gangster. He moved seamlessly through high society wearing expensive clothes. He understood a fundamental truth about criminal enterprise. The best way to hide a sprawling illegal operation is to place it directly under a bright light. Fay did not view actors and singers as artists. He viewed them as human shields. He saw their fame as a legal loophole waiting to be exploited. A known mobster opening a nightclub would immediately draw the attention of federal authorities and prohibition agents. A beloved Hollywood actress opening an exclusive arts venue would draw high society and favorable press. The police would hesitate to kick down the door of a national treasure. Fay needed a new shield to protect his expanding bootlegging operations. He looked at the theater marquees. He locked his cold eyes on Helen Morgan. Fay initiated the contact with calculated precision. He did not use physical intimidation. The Mafia understood that threats leave evidence. Coercion leaves a paper trail of panic. Fay used a far more effective weapon. He used sophisticated flattery and the illusion of financial security. He introduced himself to Helen not as a bootlegger, but as a refined art investor. He presented H himself as a wealthy patron of the arts. He attended her shows. He sent expensive arrangements to her dressing room. He cultivated an aura of absolute respect and quiet power. He requested a private meeting. He sat across from the superstar and played his part perfectly. He praised her immense talent. He validated her lifelong struggle for recognition. He told her she was too grand to simply perform in venues owned and controlled by lesser men. He planted a seed in her mind. He pitched an idea that appealed directly to her artistic ego and her deep-seated exhaustion from the studio system. He proposed opening a club dedicated entirely to her. It would be a sanctuary for high art. It would be the most exclusive, elegant spot in Manhattan. It would be called the Helen Morgan Club. Fay made the offer sound like the ultimate tribute to her success. He promised to handle all the capital investment. He promised to manage the logistics, the supply chains, and the complex real estate negotiations. He promised to hire the staff and deal with the daily headaches of business management. He told Helen she only needed to provide her name, her beautiful face, and her voice. He asked for nothing but her presence on stage. It sounded like a dream offered on a silver platter. Helen looked at the wealthy investor. She saw a benefactor who finally recognized her true worth. She felt a profound sense of validation. She believed her lifelong struggle had finally culminated in absolute ownership of her art. Her mind focused on the music, the decor, and the audience. She did not see the invisible strings attached to the offer. She did not see the sprawling criminal empire waiting to use her name as a laundering machine. Fay watched her reaction carefully. He saw the pride in her eyes. He recognized the exact moment she took the bait. He knew he had his front. He smiled warmly. The psychological grooming was complete. The trap was set. The groundwork was laid. Fay left the meeting knowing that true violence was about to begin. The lawyers on his payroll were already drafting the documents. The legal noose was ready to be slipped around the neck of Hollywood's brightest star. The meeting took place in a sterile wood-paneled office in Manhattan. Larry Fay did not bring Helen Morgan to a romantic dinner to finalize their arrangement. He brought her to a boardroom. He wanted to establish a professional atmosphere to mask the criminal transaction. Fay sat at the head of a heavy mahogany table. He was flanked by men in sharp suits. They were his lawyers, men who specialized in navigating the murky waters of Prohibition-era business law. They were experts at building legal fortresses for criminals. Helen walked into the room wearing her usual glamour. She expected a celebration of her new artistic venture. She was met with briefcases and stacks of legal paper. Fay played the role of the benevolent financier with chilling perfection. He stood up, pulled out her chair, and poured her a glass of water. He spoke in a calm, reassuring tone. He pointed to the towering piles of documents on the table and dismissed them with a wave of his hand. He called them tedious technicalities. He apologized to Helen for bringing her into such a boring environment. He framed the paperwork as an unfortunate necessity of city bureaucracy, a minor hurdle they had to clear before she could get back to the stage where she belonged. He handed her a fountain pen. He did not ask her to read the documents. He actively discouraged it. He flipped through the pages rapidly, pointing only to the bottom lines where her signature was required. He used legal jargon to bore her, deliberately creating an atmosphere of impatience. He positioned himself as the man taking on the heavy burden of the business side, so she could remain a pure artist. He told her not to worry about the fine print. He told her He had already reviewed everything to ensure her interests were protected. Helen Morgan took the P. E.N. She looked at the men in the suits. She looked at Fay, who offered a warm, encouraging smile. She did not see a gang of extortionists. She saw a team of professionals working for her success. She pressed the nib of the pen to the paper. She signed her name. She signed the lease agreements for the prime Manhattan real estate. She signed the operating licenses. She signed the employment contracts for the management staff. She signed the purchasing agreements for the venue. With every stroke of the pen, she forged a link in her own chain. She believed she was signing declarations of independence. She was actually signing confessions. The paperwork was meticulously structured to isolate the liability. By signing the documents, Helen legally established herself as the sole proprietor and the singular responsible party for the entire operation. She was the owner on record. She was legally accountable for the rent, the payroll, and most importantly, the inventory. Larry Fay did not sign a single piece of paper. His name was entirely absent from the contracts. He did not exist in the official records of the Helen Morgan Club. He was a phantom. If city inspectors demanded to see the ownership registry, they would find only the name of the famous Hollywood actress. Fay constructed a perfect legal firewall. The fire was designed to burn Helen, while Fay stood safely behind the brickwork. Weeks later, the Helen Morgan Club opened its doors to the public. It was a spectacular event. The venue was draped in velvet and lit by crystal chandeliers. The elite of New York society arrived in droves. Politicians, wealthy industrialists, and Broadway stars packed the tables. Helen sat atop a grand piano in the center of the room. She wore a stunning gown. The spotlight hit her face. The room fell dead silent as she began to sing. She looked out at the audience and felt an overwhelming sense of triumph. She believed she had conquered New York. She believed she was the master of her own domain. She was completely blind to the reality of the room. The Helen Morgan Club was not a sanctuary for high art. It was a high-volume distribution center for illegal alcohol. While Helen sang melancholic ballads in the spotlight, a massive criminal enterprise operated in the shadows just a few feet away. Behind the velvet curtains and in the secure back rooms, Fay's men were moving crates of bootleg liquor. The bartenders, who Helen thought were her employees, were actually Fay's soldiers. They poured illegal gin and whiskey at exorbitant prices. The waiters collected massive sums of cash. At the end of the night, the money was not taken to a bank under Helen's name. It was packed into briefcases and carried out the back door by armed men. Fay's syndicate absorbed every dollar of the illicit profit. Helen was paid a performer's fee. She was handed a generous envelope of cash for her singing, an allowance that kept her happy and oblivious. She never saw the accounting books. She never asked to see the ledgers. Fay had told her he would handle the boring financial details, and she trusted him completely. She lived in a bubble of applause and adulation, deliberately isolated from the brutal mechanics of the business that bore her name. Fay frequently visited the club. He walked through the front doors like any other wealthy patron. He tipped the coat check girl. He sat at a corner table in the shadows, sipping a drink and watching the operation. He looked at Helen performing on the piano. He did not look at her with romantic affection. He looked at her the way a mechanic looks at a functioning engine. She was performing her designated function flawlessly. Her celebrity was drawing the crowds. Her reputation was deterring the police. She was generating massive revenue for his syndicate simply by existing in the center of the room. The psychological trap was absolute. Helen felt empowered, yet she had never been more powerless. She walked through the club giving orders to T. He staff, believing she was the boss. The staff nodded respectfully and said yes to her face, but they only took their true orders from Fay. If Helen asked for a change in the menu or the lighting, the manager would smile, agree, and then immediately call Fay for permission. She was a guest in a house she legally owned. She was a mascot parading in front of a heavily armed cartel. The danger grew with every passing week. The Helen Morgan Club became one of the most profitable speakeasies in the city. The sheer volume of illegal alcohol flowing through the premises made it a massive target. Rival gangs knew it was Fay's territory. More importantly, the federal prohibition agents were beginning to notice the staggering amount of money changing hands at the glamorous venue. The federal government was facing immense pressure to crack down on high-profile violators of the Volstead Act. They needed to make an example of someone famous to prove that the law applied to the elite. The crosshairs were moving over Manhattan searching for a target. Larry Fay knew the raid was inevitable. It was the cost of doing business in the bootleg era. He monitored the police chatter through his paid informants. He prepared his exit strategy. He ensured his money was secure and his men had escape routes. He did not warn Helen. Warning her would cause panic. Panic would draw attention. He needed her to remain exactly where she was, sitting on the piano singing her heart out, entirely oblivious to the federal agents gathering their axes and warrants just blocks away. He needed his human shield to stand tall and catch the impact. The air inside the Helen Morgan Club was thick with expensive cigar smoke and the heavy scent of French perfume. It was a Saturday night at the peak of the winter season. The venue was packed to absolute capacity. The elite of Manhattan sat at candlelit tables, drinking illegal champagne from teacups. Helen Morgan sat on her signature grand piano in the center of the room. She wore a shimmering silk gown that caught the spotlight. She held a lace handkerchief. Her voice drifted through the room, a melancholic melody that held the entire audience in a trance. She was the undisputed queen of her domain. She felt entirely secure. She felt loved. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her empire was about to be violently dismantled. Outside the heavy oak doors of the club, federal prohibition agents were gathering in the freezing rain. They did not care about her voice. They did not care about her Hollywood pedigree. They cared about the massive volume of illicit alcohol moving through the premises. They had their warrants. They had their axes. They had their orders. Larry Fay was not in the building. He had received a phone call hours earlier from a paid informant inside the police department. He knew the raid was coming. He executed his extraction protocol with absolute precision. His lieutenants quietly emptied the hidden cash registers. They packed the night's staggering profits into leather satchels and slipped out through a subterranean service exit. They vanished into the Manhattan night, taking the money, the ledgers, and the true power with them. They did not leave a single message for the woman sitting on the piano. The shield was left in place to absorb the impact. The heavy front doors of the club did not just open, they shattered inward. Dozens of federal agents stormed into the velvet lobby. They wore heavy wool coats and carried sledgehammers and axes. The illusion of high society evaporated in a single violent second. Women screamed. Wealthy industrialists scrambled under the tables, trying to hide their faces from the sudden chaos. The agents moved with brutal efficiency. They bypassed the patrons and headed straight for the bars. They swung their axes. They smashed the imported mirrors. They shattered the crystal decanters. Thousands of gallons of illegal gin and whiskey flooded the floors, soaking into the expo. Ensive Persian rugs. The smell of raw alcohol overpowered the French perfume. Helen stopped singing. The piano player slammed his hands down on the keys in shock. Helen sat on the piano, entirely frozen. Her initial reaction was not terror. It was confusion. She possessed the deep, ingrained arrogance of a celebrity who had never faced real consequences. She believed there had been a terrible misunderstanding. She looked around the room, waiting for her management staff to step forward and handle the intrusion. She waited for Larry Fay's sophisticated men to present the proper paperwork and send the police away. Nobody stepped forward. The men in the sharp suits who usually managed the floor had evaporated. She was entirely alone in a sea of screaming patrons and swinging axes. A senior federal agent waded through the chaos and walked directly toward the spotlight. He stopped at the grand piano. He looked up at the Hollywood superstar. He did not ask for an autograph. He did not remove his hat. He spoke with the cold, mechanical tone of the law. He demanded to speak to the legal proprietor of the establishment. Helen looked down at him. She summoned her stage presence. She attempted to use her charm, the same charm that had conquered Broadway and Hollywood. She smiled a confused, patronizing smile. She announced that she was Helen Morgan, and this was her club. She expected the agent to apologize for the disruption. She expected him to recognize her authority. The agent did not apologize. He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a pair of cold steel handcuffs. He told her she was under arrest for massive violations of the Volstead Act. He ordered her off the piano. Helen laughed nervously. She thought it was a heavy-handed joke. She told the agent she was just a singer. She explained that she did not handle the alcohol or the business. She told him to find the manager. She told him to find Larry Fay. The agent pulled a folded document from his pocket. It was a copy of the municipal business license and the commercial lease agreement. He unfolded the paper and held it up to the spotlight. He pointed a thick, calloused finger to the bottom of the page. There was her signature, the elegant, flowing handwriting of Helen Morgan. The agent looked her dead in the eye and delivered the reality of her situation. He told her there were no other managers on record. He told her there was no Larry Fay in the corporate registry. According to the United States government, she was the sole owner, the sole operator, and the sole financier of a multi-million-dollar bootlegging syndicate. The ink on the paper sealed her fate. Her ignorance was not a legal defense. It was a confession. The cold reality struck her like a physical blow. The psychological trap snapped shut with a deafening crack. The sophisticated legal documents Fay had presented to her in the boardroom were not tools of empowerment. They were her own arrest warrants. She had signed away her freedom for the illusion of control. She stepped off the piano. Her legs trembled. The agent grabbed her wrists. He snapped the cold steel handcuffs around her delicate wrists. The metal bit into her skin. They did not let her change her clothes. They did not let her call a lawyer. They marched her through the center of the ruined club. The elite patrons watched in stunned silence as the Queen of Broadway was dragged through the puddles of spilled liquor and broken glass. The true brutality of Fay's plan revealed itself outside the club. When the agents pushed Helen through the shattered front doors and onto the cold sidewalk, the night erupted in blinding flashes of light. Dozens of press photographers and tabloid reporters were waiting on the street. Larry Fay had tipped them off. He needed a massive public spectacle to distract the federal authorities from his vanishing syndicate. He served Helen Morgan to the press on a silver platter. The flash bulbs popped relentlessly, capturing every angle of her humiliation. They photographed the glamorous Hollywood star shivering in the freezing rain, wearing a ruined silk gown with her hands chained together like a common street thug. She tried to hide her face behind her lace handkerchief, but the photographers pushed closer, shouting questions, demanding a statement from the fallen idol. She was shoved into the back of a dark police wagon. The metal doors slammed shut, locking her in the pitch black. The sirens wailed as the wagon sped through the streets of Manhattan toward the precinct. Helen sat on the hard metal bench, the smell of stale sweat and vomit surrounding her. The transition was violent and absolute. In less than an hour, she had been ripped from a velvet throne and thrown into a rolling steel cage. She was processed at the federal precinct like any other criminal. The officers stripped her of her jewelry. They took her fingerprints. They stood her in front of a height chart and took a mugshot. Her mascara ran down her face in dark, jagged streaks. Her glamour was entirely stripped away, leaving only a terrified, exhausted woman facing decades in a federal penitentiary. She was placed in a concrete holding cell. She sat on a rigid metal cot. The silence of the cell was deafening after the chaos of the raid. She waited for her lawyers. She waited for the studio executives to bail her out. Above all, she waited for Larry Fay to walk through the door and fix the massive misunderstanding. She still clung to the desperate hope that Fay was a legitimate businessman who had simply run into legal trouble. Hours passed. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room finally opened. 2 federal detectives walked in. They did not bring Larry Fay. They brought boxes of financial records seized from the club. They dropped the heavy boxes onto the metal table. They began the interrogation. It was a relentless psychological beating. They did not physically touch her. They battered her with questions she could not answer. They asked her for the names of her liquor suppliers. They asked for the shipping routes from Canada. They asked for the account numbers of the offshore banks where the illicit cash was deposited. They asked her to detail the hierarchy of the violent street gangs protecting the shipments. Helen sobbed. She repeated over and over that she knew nothing. She told them she only sang the songs. She told them she was just the face of the operation. She begged them to find Larry Fay. The detectives leaned over the table. Their expressions were entirely devoid of sympathy. They looked at her the way they looked at hardened mafia bosses. They did not believe a single word she said. They viewed her tears as a calculated performance by a brilliant actress. They opened the files and presented the evidence. They showed her the purchasing orders for hundreds of cases of illegal whiskey. Her signature was at the bottom. They showed her the payroll records for men with extensive criminal records, men who worked as violent enforcers. Her signature authorized their paychecks. They showed her the tax documents deliberately falsifying the club's revenue. Her signature certified the fraud. The trap was absolute and perfect. Her genuine ignorance of the criminal enterprise made her look like a hardened, uncooperative syndicate boss refusing to break under interrogation. Because her name was the only name on the paperwork, the federal government legally required her to know every detail of the operation. Her inability to provide the names of the real gangsters was interpreted as a strict adherence to the Mafia code of silence. Larry Fay had not just used her as a shield. He had engineered a situation where her very innocence served as the ultimate proof of her guilt in the eyes of the law. She sat in the cold interrogation room, staring at the mountains of paper bearing her signature, the elegant handwriting she had used to sign autographs for millions of adoring fans had been weaponized to destroy her life. She realized with a crushing wave of despair that there was no misunderstanding. The law was functioning exactly as it was designed to function based on the evidence provided. and Larry Fay had provided the perfect evidence to ensure she took the fall. She was entirely alone, buried alive under a mountain of legal documents, facing the full wrath of the United States government, while the true architect of her destruction counted his money in the dark. Dawn arrived in Manhattan not with warm sunlight, but with the brutal thud of newspaper bundles hitting the freezing pavement. Helen Morgan sat in her concrete holding cell. The adrenaline of the raid had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, paralyzing dread. She waited for the heavy steel door to open. She waited for her powerful studio executives to arrive with high-priced lawyers. She waited for the Hollywood machine to deploy its massive public relations apparatus to rescue its most valuable asset. She believed her celebrity status was a permanent shield. She did not realize that celebrity is merely a lease granted by the public, and Larry Fay had just ordered the eviction. Miles away in a secure location, Larry Fay drank his morning coffee and reviewed the night's events. He was entirely unbothered by the loss of the Helen Morgan Club. The physical venue and the confiscated alcohol were simply the cost of doing business in the bootlegging industry. He was a tactician, and he recognized the only remaining threat to his freedom. Helen Morgan was in federal custody. She was terrified, and terrified people talk. He knew she could not give the police operational details because she knew none, but she had a massive voice. If she walked out of that precinct and gave a tearful interview to the press, the public might demand a deeper investigation. If the public rallied behind their favorite singer, the federal government would be forced to hunt for the real mastermind. Fay could not allow the public to view Ellen as a victim. He needed to transform her into a monster. He initiated the most vicious phase of his operation. He did not dispatch hitmen to silence her. He used a weapon that was far more destructive and completely legal. He weaponized the printing presses. Fay reached into his endless reserves of illicit cash and dispatched his bagmen to the back doors of the city's most ruthless tabloid newspapers. He purchased the editorial narrative. He bribed journalists. He paid off editors. He fed the press a meticulously fabricated story designed to annihilate Helen Morgan's character. The smear campaign was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Fay understood the dark psychology of the American public. They loved to elevate a star to the heavens, but they harbored a deep, vicious appetite for watching a star plummet to the earth. Fay gave them exactly what they craved. The newspapers did not report the raid as a tragic misunderstanding involving a naive artist. They reported it as the spectacular downfall of a criminal mastermind. The headlines screamed from the newsstands. They labeled Helen Morgan a degenerate bootlegger. They painted her melancholic, emotional stage persona as a brilliant, cynical cover for a ruthless syndicate boss. The articles claimed she used her Hollywood glamour to seduce high society while secretly poisoning the city with illegal liquor. They described her as a powerful underworld figure, a woman who commanded violent street gangs and manipulated the financial markets. The press took the very traits that made her beloved, her tragic aura and her intense independence, and twisted them into evidence of a dark, criminal sociopathy. Inside the precinct, a guard tossed a morning edition through the bars of Helen's cell. It hit the concrete floor. She picked it up with trembling hands. The psychological blow she suffered in that moment was far worse than the physical shock of the handcuffs. She stared at her own mugshot on the front page. The harsh L hiding stripped away her beauty, making her look haggard and dangerous. She read the brutal words printed beneath her face: racketeer, kingpin, smuggler. The sheer weight of the public humiliation broke her remaining resolve. The violent destruction of her honor was absolute. She had spent her entire life building a reputation as a dedicated artist. She had sacrificed everything for her public image. In a matter of hours, a man she had trusted had purchased the total annihilation of her identity. She realized the horrific brilliance of Fay's strategy. He was not just punishing her, he was strategically dismantling her credibility. By destroying her reputation in the public square, Fay cut off her only avenue of escape. He knew the federal judges and prosecutors read the same newspapers as everyone else. If Helen stood in a courtroom and claimed she was an innocent singer, duped by a shadow investor named Larry Fay, the jury would look at her and see the degenerate mob queen they read about over breakfast. Her truth would sound like the desperate lie of a cornered criminal. She would have zero public sympathy. Fay had successfully shifted the entire weight of public outrage onto her fragile shoulders, ensuring the authorities would focus entirely on prosecuting the fallen star, while the true mob boss remained invisible. The isolation became total. The Hollywood machine, which Helen believed would save her, reacted exactly as Fay had predicted. The scandal inflicted massive damage on her public image and drained her finances, but it did not permanently end her career. She continued to perform, eventually cementing her legacy by starring as Julie Laverne in the 1936 cinematic adaptation of Showboat. However, the staggering legal fees and relentless public scrutiny initiated a downward spiral she could not fully escape. She was entirely alone. The men in Washington saw a high-profile conviction that would validate their war on alcohol. The tabloids saw a gold mine that will sell millions of papers. Larry Fay saw a perfectly executed distraction. Nobody saw Helen Morgan. The human being was completely erased, replaced by a convenient legal scapegoat. She was eventually released on a massive bail, but she walked out of the precinct into a world that no longer recognized her. She was no longer a beloved icon. She was a pariah. She could not walk down the street without facing the flashes of press cameras and the hostile stares of the public. She returned to her luxurious apartment, but it felt like a mausoleum. The telephone did not ring. The fan mail stopped arriving, replaced by hate mail. She was trapped in the agonizing silence of a canceled life. She realized she was fighting a ghost. Larry Fay never contacted her. He never issued a threat. He simply vanished, leaving her to suffocate in the toxic atmosphere he had engineered. He had used her name to build his empire, and then he used her blood to extinguish the fire. The trial was approaching. The federal government was preparing to throw the full weight of its legal machinery at her. She had no allies. She had no voice in the press. She had nothing left but the terrifying realization that she was going to pay the ultimate price for a crime she did not commit, orchestrated by a man the law could not find. The federal indictment arrived as a thick stack of rigid legal documents. It outlined multiple violations of the Volstead Act, conspiracy to distribute illicit narcotics, and massive tax evasion. Helen Morgan sat in her rapidly emptying apartment and stared at the charges. She was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. To fight the United States government, she needed a formidable legal defense. She quickly discovered that the financial trap Larry Fay had engineered was far more complex and destructive than a simple police raid. The arrest was only the first phase. The second phase was total financial extraction. The elite law firms of Manhattan recognized a desperate target. Senior partners read the tabloid coverage. They knew the major Hollywood studios had severed her contracts and that her future earning potential was effectively zero. They demanded staggering upfront cash retainers to take her case. Helen was forced to hire aggressive, high-priced attorneys to keep herself out of a concrete cell. She believed she was paying for a vigorous defense. She did not realize she was funding the final stage of her own liquidation. The corporate structure of the Helen Morgan Club was a loaded weapon pointed directly at her bank accounts. When the federal agents raided the venue, they did not just confiscate the illegal alcohol. They levied astronomical fines against the business entity for operating an unlicensed speakeasy and evading federal liquor taxes. Because Larry Fay had meticulously ensured his name was absent from every document, the United States Treasury Department aimed its massive collection apparatus directly at the sole legal proprietor. The government assessed the total value of the seized contraband and billed Helen Morgan for the entire amount. The liability extended beyond the federal government. Fay's syndicate had incurred massive operational debts running the club. There were unpaid vendors, outstanding leases on warehouse spaces, and massive municipal penalties for property damage caused during the raid. The creditors came looking for their money. They did not hunt for a phantom mob boss in the underworld. They looked at the legally binding contracts. They saw Helen Morgan's signature. They filed aggressive civil lawsuits against her. Helen was dragged into a grueling sequence of civil courts while simultaneously preparing for a criminal trial. The legal fees compounded daily. Her attorneys advised her to settle the civil disputes and pay the federal fines quietly to demonstrate cooperation with the authorities. They told her it was the only way to secure leniency from the criminal judge. She complied out of sheer terror. She authorized her accountants to release the funds. The financial hemorrhage was systematic and absolute. The wealth she had accumulated through years of relentless touring and blockbuster film roles was drained to satisfy the debts of a criminal cartel. She liquidated her extensive investment portfolios. The massive royalties generated by her hit records were seized by creditors before they ever reached her bank account. The money she earned singing on the stages of Broadway was transferred directly to the United States Treasury to pay the penalties for bootleg gin she never drank and never sold. She was forced to dismantle the physical evidence of her success. She sold her luxury Manhattan real estate at a massive loss to generate immediate liquid cash. She sold the grand pianos she had practiced on. She emptied her vaults. She sold the diamond necklaces, the platinum rings, and the bespoke couture gowns. She stood in her living room and watched moving companies carry away her furniture to auction houses. She was stripped of everything she had earned. The psychological horror of the financial drain was worse than the threat of prison. Helen slowly understood the true mechanics of her destruction. She was not merely taking the blame for the Mafia. She was acting as their bank. Every time she wrote a check to settle a federal fine for a confiscated shipment of liquor, she was balancing Larry Fay's ledger. She was paying for the illicit inventory his men had lost. She was funding the bribes he had handed to corrupt municipal inspectors. Her artistic legacy was being ground into raw cash to fuel an underworld war machine. She had spent her life perfecting her voice, and the mob was using the proceeds to buy bullets and silence. The criminal trial commenced. It was a humiliating public spectacle. The prosecution treated her with absolute contempt. They presented the signed leases, the falsified tax returns, and the payroll records of known felons. They painted a picture, of a cynical, wealthy celebrity who believed she was above the law. The jury looked at the exhausted, terrified woman sitting at the defense table. They did not see a victim of extortion. They saw the degenerate kingpin the tabloids had invented. The government needed a high-profile conviction to prove that the prohibition laws were effective against the elite class. They used Helen as a political trophy. Her legal team fought a desperate, grinding battle. They managed to introduce enough reasonable doubt regarding her direct operational control to avoid the maximum federal sentence. A federal jury ultimately acquitted her of the Volstead Act charges, recognizing that she was a front rather than the criminal mastermind. However, the victory was entirely hollow. The legal system had already achieved its primary objective. The process itself was the execution. The court battles dragged on for months, ensuring her name remained tethered to criminal activity in the public consciousness. The constant stress and public humiliation shattered her physical and mental health. She walked down the granite steps of the federal courthouse, a free woman in the eyes of the penal system, but she was a prisoner of her circumstances. Her bank accounts were completely empty. Her credit was destroyed. Larry Fay avoided federal prosecution for the Helen Morgan Club raid, moving quickly to open new illegal venues. However, his ruthlessness eventually caught up with him. In 1933, 8 years before Morgan's death, Fay was shot and killed by a disgruntled employee at his Casablanca club, a violent end to his reign over the New York underworld. Helen Morgan moved into a cheap, rented room in a dilapidated boarding house. The silence of her new reality was absolute. The underworld had extracted every cent of her wealth and moved on to the next vulnerable target. She was entirely discarded by both worlds. She sat in the dark room with no contracts, no money, and no voice. The decline into absolute destitution was not a sudden plunge, but a slow, agonizing suffocation inside the cramped room of a cheap boarding house. The silence of the room was a physical weight. For over a decade, her life had been scored by the constant roar of applause, the frantic ringing of telephones, and the aggressive flash of press cameras. Now the silence was absolute. The theatrical producers who once fought for her signature refused to take her calls. She was no longer a valuable asset. She was a radioactive liability. She attempted to secure work. She walked into the booking agencies that had once begged to represent her. The agents did not look at her with the reverence reserved for a Broadway legend. They looked at her with cold calculation. They saw the criminal record. They saw the tabloid headlines that Larry Fay had purchased to destroy her honor. They knew that booking Helen Morgan meant inviting police scrutiny, protesting morality groups, and the lingering stench of underworld association. They politely declined her services. She was forced to seek employment in the dingy, unlit taverns and forgotten vaudeville houses on the outskirts of the city. She performed for a fraction of her former fee, singing the same melancholic torch songs to small, disinterested crowds. The physical toll of the legal and financial destruction began to manifest. The relentless stress of the federal trial, the public humiliation, and the total liquidation of her wealth shattered her nervous system. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life insulated by wealth and management. She possessed no survival skills for the brutal reality of poverty. She was haunted by the knowledge that her life's work had been converted into raw cash to fuel a criminal cartel. She knew that the money she had earned singing on stage was used by Fay to bribe judges, purchase illicit cargo, and pay the salaries of violent street enforcers. She had been weaponized against her own society. She required an escape from the crushing weight of her reality. She turned to the very substance that had engineered her downfall. The irony was brutal and absolute. The illegal alcohol that Fay had sold in her name had triggered the federal raid. Now, she sought refuge in cheap legal liquor to numb the psychological horror of the aftermath. She drank to forget the interrogations. She drank to forget the sight of her own furniture being carried away by creditors. She drank to silence the terrifying realization that the man who ruined her was still operating freely in the upper echelons of New York society, entirely unpunished by the law. The alcohol accelerated her decline. It did not provide an escape. It simply expedited her physical destruction. The mesmerizing, tragic voice that had defined an era grew raspy and weak. The fragile, captivating beauty that had commanded billboards across the nation faded, replaced by the bloated, exhausted reality of severe alcoholism. She became unreliable. She missed the few low-paying performances she managed to secure. The managers of the rundown taverns fired her. She slipped further down the economic ladder, vanishing into the forgotten margins of the entertainment industry. The public moved on with ruthless efficiency. The American appetite for celebrity is voracious but possesses a severely limited memory. The era of prohibition ended. The Volstead Act was repealed. The speakeasies were replaced by legal nightclubs. The country plunged into the Great Depression and then geared up for a global war. The name Helen Morgan became a faded trivia question, a ghost from a bygone era. The public forgot the brilliant singer who sat on the grand piano. They only remembered the vague, scandalous outline of a woman who got mixed up with the mob and lost everything. Larry Fay's smear campaign had achieved permanent, historical success. Helen fled New York. The city was a graveyard of her ambitions and a constant reminder of her humiliation. She retreated to Chicago, the city where she had first clawed her way out of the chorus lines. She hoped to find anonymity, or perhaps a faint echo of her early resilience. She found neither. She was entirely broken. Her body, subjected to years of intense stress and relentless alcohol abuse, finally surrendered. Her liver failed. The internal organs simply shut down, poisoned by the only coping mechanism she had left. In October of 1941, the woman who had starred in the global blockbuster Showboat was admitted to a hospital in Chicago. There was no private suite. There were no studio executives pacing the hallways. There were no extravagant floral arrangements from wealthy admirers. She lay in a standard charity bed. She was surrounded by the clinical, indifferent sounds of a public hospital ward. She was entirely destitute. The vast fortune she had accumulated through sheer talent and relentless work had been entirely consumed by the legal and financial machinery of the Underworld. On October 9, 1941, Helen Morgan died. She was 41 years old. The cause of death was officially listed as cirrhosis of the liver. The medical examiner recorded the biological failure. The document did not record the true cause of the fatality. It did not mention the meticulously drafted lease agreements. It did not mention the federal fines, the missing ledgers, or the perfectly executed character assassination. Her financial and legal ruin began the exact moment she signed the ownership documents in Fay's office. The tragic trajectory of Helen Morgan stands as a brutal, permanent autopsy of the relationship between fame and organized crime. The public remains captivated by the illusion of the underworld. They romanticize the danger. They believe that a celebrity associating with a mafia boss creates an untouchable power couple. They believe the criminal element respects the artist. The reality is entirely clinical and utterly devoid of romance. The Mafia does not consume art. The Mafia consumes leverage. Larry Fay did not look at Helen Morgan and see a woman to protect. He looked at her and saw a corporate structure. He saw a dummy corporation with a beautiful face and a flawless public reputation. He utilized her fame as a mechanism to deflect federal law enforcement. He utilized her bank accounts as an insurance policy against government fines. He utilized her reputation as collateral. When the federal government brought the hammer down, the Mafia operated exactly as it was designed to operate. The syndicate insulated the leadership and sacrificed the front. Fay walked away with the illicit profits, leaving Helen to face the prison sentences and the financial ruin. He demonstrated the ultimate, horrifying truth of the underworld ecosystem. The gangsters survive because they always ensure someone else bleeds for their crimes. Helen Morgan paid the ultimate price for her naivety. She believed she was signing a contract to secure her artistic legacy. She signed a Faustian bargain that stripped her of her wealth, her honor, and her life. Her voice remains preserved on old phonograph records, a beautiful haunting echo of the 1920s. But the true legacy of Helen Morgan is not found in the music. It is found in the brutal mechanics of her destruction. Her story is a chilling warning that in the dark, predatory waters of the criminal underworld, a bright light does not offer protection. A bright light simply makes you the perfect target.